I can't tell you how pleased and honored I am to have present here today the leading Chinese democracy fighter, Mr. Wei Jingsheng. I've known and followed Mr. Wei and his activities and writings for almost 2 decades. The trials and suffering he endured in prison in China as a democracy activist are the stuff of legend, and it's hard to comprehend how he survived his ordeals. Any of us ordinary mortals would likely not have been able to endure. His existence and presence here today are emblematic of his resolve to bring freedom, openness, and democracy to China. The award the U.S. Business and Industry Council is presenting to Mr. Wei is entitled the Economic Freedom Award. That may seem a little bit of a non sequitur, since I've just discussed his longstanding involvement in the Chinese democracy movement. But those of us who follow Mr. Wei's writing, for us it's quite natural. He's devoted much thinking to the Chinese economy and business class in China, and he understands that an open economy and free markets are part and parcel of Chinese democracy. A democratic economy is the flip side of the coin of a political democracy. During the battle against granting China PNTR in 1999 and 2000 and its accession to the World Trade Organization, Mr. Wei and I worked closely together. And by the way, he reminded me recently that we were right and the WTO advocates were wrong. We said membership would be a large mistake, only strengthening and emboldening China's leadership and allowing it to claim legitimacy, political legitimacy, on the basis of bringing about economic growth in China. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 14 years since China became a WTO member. And I'm reminded of one anecdote. At one point, we went to see Tom DeLay, who was then the majority whip in the House of Representatives. And I wanted him to hear directly from Mr. Wei about the situation in China. When I was in politics in New York, we had a saying that if you want to know who's going to win a horse race, don't ask a tout, ask one of the horses. And Mr. Wei was the leading racehorse. So I admit when we went to see DeLay, I was surprised because Mr. Wei gave a very thorough explanation of the nature of doing business in China and the mindset and activities of the business class there, what the princelings were up to, what others were up to in business and economics. And at that point I realized, and this is 15 years ago, that his thinking on democracy went beyond politics to a grasp of the essential element of free markets, free and open markets, as a concomitant part of democracy. So the award today is the Economic Freedom Award, and it isn't a non sequitur. Mr. Wei has been thinking about economics and trade and business these many years, and those of you who get his newsletter or follow his writings know that very well. So with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Wei to stand. And let me read the award. It says, the U.S. Business and Industry Council proudly honors Wei Jingsheng, a champion of economic freedom, an exceptional advocate for balanced trade relations between the Chinese and American peoples. Thank you for accepting our award. Mr. Wei will now deliver several portions of his speech, and because we're running so late, Ms. Huang will then interpret those portions and continue with the speech in English. In other words, we will have the full Chinese available, but it won't be the full Chinese won't be presented right now. Part of it will be presented, and then Ms. Wang will go through the majority of the speech.
I said that the Chinese Communist Party would not automatically enter a democratic system due to economic progress, as some have proclaimed. 15 years have passed, and we still see the one-party dictatorship of the Communist Party. The communist regime in China claims it is the most democratic system in the world, a true democracy. Xi Jinping is launching a mandatory campaign called Prohibiting the Promotion of Decadent Value of the Westerners. Many informers have received rewards for that, even those who tease themselves by fabricating lies not to get promoted and rich. I said that the Chinese government would not abide by trade rules. Instead, it will destroy those rules in order to make trade unilaterally favorable. This is because China is a normal society by rule of law. 15 years later, China has not changed its character of being unreasonable. Not only does the Chinese government not abide by the rules of international trade, it does not abide the rules within China either. In recent years, we see the best proof as many foreign companies had to exit China after suffering terribly. Now the Chinese government not only does not comply with the rules of international trade, but also is trying to develop the rules of international trade in accordance with China's approach, just as what I said back then. If the Chinese Communist Party is successful, then the international trade rules, one of the foundations that have been maintaining world peace after World War II, will cease to exist. The relatively peaceful situation of the past, more than half a century, will be difficult to sustain. Back then, I said that those billions of dollars of US trade deficit with China will rapidly expand. It only took 10 years for the trade deficit to reach $300 billion US in 2011. So the US economy continues to decline because of this deficit, when the Chinese economy rapidly grows due to it. This is equal to United States gave a blood transfusion to the Chinese Communist Party. Many American workers lost their jobs, yet the Chinese workers did not gain too much real income. Chinese and American billionaires have rapidly increased. The gap between rich and poor of both countries has been expanded simultaneously. The housing price in China have been pushed up to the level of Tokyo and New York by the billionaire speculators, while most of the poor people can only crowd into small apartments. There are other people who have revenues even less than that past and cannot even eat meat even once for the whole year. This is the so-called benefits to the Chinese people when America gave transfusion blood to China, yet avoid talking about human rights. If this situation could continue and thus allow the big American company to continue to make money, perhaps Americans' big business, along with their politicians and scholars they support, would not care. Then American middle class would be the only unlucky ones. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping and his accomplices do not think it can continue. Sober-senior US scholars do not think so, and the Chinese people do not think so. At the beginning, it was some poor Chinese who were not willing to continue this way, and then the rich Chinese who also know it cannot continue so. And now even the sober-minded communist leaders have to admit it would be a disaster if it continues so, until collapse of the country and collapse of the Communist Party. As we all know, China's economy is rapidly declining, with all the indicators illustrating that it has entered an economic crisis similar to the Great Depression of the US in the 1930s. Just like the United States, China is also a big country, so the economic crisis could not have spread to the globe. In fact, now it is already spreading to the world. US growth has stopped. The economy in Europe is clearly in trouble. All those troubles are associated with a severe economic downturn in China or its economic crisis. If this trend continues, the global economy would maybe enter a serious recession and even economic crisis. So how to save the Chinese economy? The first is to open the Chinese market and to implement truly fair free trade instead of a free trade that is only unilateral. The second is to respect human rights. A massive increase of Chinese domestic consumer market. Only when those two policies are conducted at the same time, it may save the Chinese economy and benefit the people of both China and the United States at the same time, and benefit the global economy at the same time. So let us open China's market to reach a fair free trade in reality. This would not only be beneficial to exports of the United States, but also be beneficial to recover the already nearly destroyed international trade rules. During the current international trade, non-tariff barriers have been increasingly prevalent. States are more inclined to use domestic legislations to replace fair international trade rules. One-way free trade and one-way unfair trade is the biggest obstacles toward economic development and also the main cause of the recent economic recession. Yet, China has been and is playing the largest and a major role, like being a role model of this one-way traffic. Opening the Chinese market would not only meet the needs of the world trade, but also the needs for the Chinese economy to recover its development. After 15 years development of the Chinese economy at a high yet abnormal speed, it has entered the so-called middle income trap. The inertia of reliance on cheap labor has resulted in the overall technical and the management level of China's economy to be poor, to be low. Products and technology, and even the enterprises itself need a replacement to avoid the point of collapse soon. To import those services from the United States in large quantity is the only way to solve these problems. In order to avoid China's local monopolies and industrial monopolies, China must follow the rules of fair trade on its own domestic law instead of continue unfair rules of the past. Otherwise, it is impossible to solve its problem to get out the middle income trap. Under the extreme pressure from the China's internal interest group, without the external pressure from the USA, no one can take the initiative to open China's market. Suppose Xi Jinping had this motivation. He must resort to strong pressure from the United States to be able to raise the issue of open market in China. Moreover, many Chinese people have a problem in the way of their thinking. They are like some sorts of rednecks who would think that they must have taken advantage of when the others are benefited. Regarding the likelihood of good things that they are benefited by, while others have also benefited, they would give a surprise laugh followed by disbelief. To treat it as as a story told by Hollywood. Only when the others force them to lose, they may realize later that they were benefited. Most of the communists in China are in such a mental state. So the United States can only try to force China to accept the principle of free trade that are fair. Otherwise, USA cannot give back to China a non-free trade to be fair. An unfair non-free trade would only result neither market of both countries be open. To open China's market means it's necessary to protect the basic human rights. Without the protection of human rights, without freedom of expression and association, workers, the majority of Chinese labor force, would have no collective bargaining rights. Without collective bargaining rights, it is impossible to raise workers' income greatly on a large scale. Thus, it is impossible to significantly expand the domestic market inside China, and it is impossible to improve more, to provide more export markets for US companies. At the same time, it is impossible to solve the plight of China's economy. Some people thought they would open China's market without protecting human rights, including the human rights of the American businessman. However, when there is the promise of no guarantee of human rights, will the goods, the technology, the business, and the management of the USA to be successfully settled in China? Look at those enterprises and businessmen who leave China like an ebb tide. One would be able to draw a conclusion. This will not be good to either American business or their businessmen. This would not be good to China's economy either. This would only be good to the bureaucratic monopoly and the bureaucratic capitalists in China. The results of not guaranteeing human rights in China is that China's economy loses its last chance to save itself. When China's economy collapses, the world economy will enter recession in various degrees. This would not be good to all the people. So, free trade must be multilateral fair trade. Otherwise, it would bring bad fruits for everyone. Promoting the protection of human rights is one of the basic conditions for free trade. It relates to the rights and interests of everyone. It should be the goal of the Chinese, the Americans, and everyone must be concerned about and working hard at. Thank you again.